What would you do if you were falsely accused of something you didn't do? How far would you go to prove your innocence? What if the system was stacked against you from the start? James Carter's quiet life was shattered in a moment, and now he's fighting back. But can one man's legal knowledge take down a system of bias and corruption? Watch as the truth unravels in this shocking tale. Like and subscribe for more. James Carter, a 35-year-old financial consultant in Atlanta, Georgia, lived a life of routine and order. He was the kind of man who valued simplicity and peace, avoiding drama whenever possible. His days were filled with work, meetings, reports, and calculations, and his evenings were spent at home, unwinding in solitude. James had never been the type to seek attention or stir up trouble. He had carved out a quiet life for himself, one that he was content with. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling week at work, James decided to treat himself to a quick coffee and snack. He pulled into a local convenience store near his apartment, hoping for a few minutes of peace before heading home. The store was quiet, with only a few customers wandering the aisles. James picked up his coffee and a small pack of crackers, then walked to the self-checkout, ready to get in and out quickly. Once his purchase was completed, he placed the receipt in his pocket, grabbed his coffee, and turned to leave. It was a typical stop, nothing noteworthy, just a brief break in an otherwise ordinary day. But as he approached the door, he felt a strange unease. A sudden tension in the air made him pause. That familiar feeling crept up, the one that tells you someone is watching. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." James froze. He turned slowly, expecting to see another customer, but instead he found himself face to face with a uniformed officer. Officer Linda Hayes stood a few feet away, her hand resting on her holstered gun. Her posture was rigid and her expression was unreadable. James' heart skipped a beat and a flash of confusion shot through him. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, trying to assess the situation. His gaze flickered to the few other people in the store, but they were watching silently, making no move to intervene. "I saw you put something in your pocket," Officer Hayes stated flatly, her voice cold and commanding. There was no hint of doubt in her tone, just the certainty of someone who had already made up their mind. James blinked, taken aback. "I just bought these," he said, motioning to the coffee and snack in his hand. "You can check the register." Without a word, Hayes moved closer, her eyes narrowing as she scanned him up and down. "I said show me your receipt," she demanded, her voice growing sharper. James sighed inwardly but complied, reaching into his pocket to pull out the receipt. As he handed it to her, he noticed how quickly she snatched it from his hand, barely glancing at the paper before shaking her head dismissively. "Nice try," she muttered. "Empty your pockets." "I don't have anything in my pockets," James said, his frustration rising. The people in the store had begun to notice the exchange, their gazes shifting between him and the officer, but no one said a word. James felt the tension mounting, as though he were being watched by more than just the customers in the store. Hayes wasn't listening. She was intent on escalating the situation, ignoring the fact that James had followed the proper procedures and had nothing to hide. The weight of the moment was sinking in. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was something deeper. Something unfair, and James could feel it. James stood frozen, the weight of Officer Hayes' words sinking in. He had paid for everything, there was no mistake. Yet Hayes' eyes were fixed on him, her stance unwavering. She wasn't interested in his explanation. "Show me your receipt," she demanded again, her voice sharp and firm. James felt his frustration grow. "Here," he said, pulling out the receipt and handing it to her. He hoped that presenting the proof would clear everything up. Hayes snatched it without looking closely, then shook her head. "Nice try," she muttered, not even giving the receipt a second glance. "I didn't take anything," James insisted, Check the register, check the cameras, I paid for everything. But Officer Hayes wasn't listening. Empty your pockets, she ordered, her tone now demanding, as if she had already decided he was guilty. I don't have anything in my pockets, James replied, his voice becoming firmer as his frustration grew. The tension in the store was palpable now. Customers had stopped what they were doing, watching the interaction unfold with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The store clerk, a young man in his 20s, stepped forward, trying to intervene. I saw him pay for everything, he said, his voice uncertain, but Hayes silenced him with a sharp glare. Stay out of this, she snapped, dismissing the clerk with a wave of her hand. James felt the weight of the situation settling in. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding, it was becoming something far more serious. Officer Hayes had made up her mind the moment she saw him. The clerk's testimony, his receipt, it didn't matter. I didn't steal anything, James repeated, trying to stay calm, but it was clear Hayes wasn't interested in hearing him. She spoke into her radio, her tone cold and professional. Possible shoplifting suspect, resisting compliance. Resisting compliance, James asked, his voice rising in disbelief. I'm not resisting anything, I'm just telling you the truth. Hayes ignored him, her focus entirely on the radio as she reached for his wrist. James took a step back instinctively, but before he could react, he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap against his wrists. This is ridiculous, James said, his frustration building as she guided him toward the door. This wasn't just a mistake. It was happening, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Outside, the air felt heavier, colder. As they reached the squad car, James glanced at his reflection in the glass door. For the first time, he saw what it was like to be on the other side of the law. His heart pounded, and he knew this wasn't going to end quickly. It was only the beginning. The ride to the station was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the radio. James remained silent in the back of the car, his mind racing, but knowing better than to speak. He had seen enough to know that anything he said could be twisted against him. His hands clenched, the metal cuffs biting into his wrists as the streets of Atlanta blurred past. This wasn't just a small inconvenience anymore. His life had just been turned upside down. James sat alone in the cold, sterile holding cell, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing incessantly. The full weight of his wrongful arrest had started to sink in, but instead of despair, a sense of determination began to fill him. He knew that sitting back and waiting for the system to clear his name wouldn't work. It had never worked for people like him. He needed to take control. "Where's my lawyer?" James had demanded earlier, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not speaking without legal representation." Officer Hayes had dismissed him with a shrug, claiming that he'd be processed soon enough, offering no help or even an explanation. James wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. His law degree, though not practiced recently, was enough to equip him with the knowledge to challenge the system. He wasn't going to sit idly by while a false accusation threatened to ruin his life. The hours in the holding cell felt endless. But in that quiet, isolated space, James began mentally preparing for the battle ahead. He focused on the glaring errors in Officer Hayes' report. The biggest of them was her failure to check the store's security footage. Every officer knew that reviewing the security cameras was standard protocol before making an arrest, yet Hayes had chosen not to do that. This was a critical mistake. On top of that, she had ignored the store clerk's testimony and failed to even consider her own body camera footage. These were holes in her story, and James was determined to expose them. The next morning, James walked into the courtroom with a calm resolve, his hands still cuffed but his mind sharp. His choice to represent himself was risky, but it was the only way to ensure his voice wouldn't be overshadowed by an attorney who might not understand the nuances of his case. The courtroom fell silent as James approached the defense table. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him. Officer Hayes standing confidently with her arms crossed, the prosecutor wearing a self-assured smirk. To them, this was just another easy case, another simple conviction. They had no idea what was coming. When the judge called the court to order, James stood up, adjusting his tie and taking a slow, steady breath. His voice rang out in the courtroom, firm and unwavering. "Your Honor, I will be representing myself in this case," he began. His words caused a ripple through the room, but James remained focused. "I am not here to deny what happened in that store. I am here to prove that I am innocent of these charges." The prosecutor immediately began his opening statement, painting James as a common shoplifter caught red-handed, with nothing but Officer Hayes' testimony to back it up. But James wasn't fazed. He already knew that the case against him was built on a foundation of assumptions, not facts. When it was his turn, James didn't hesitate. He stood tall, walking confidently toward the podium. The prosecutor and Officer Hayes both watched him, but James didn't look at them. He focused on the judge, knowing he had to win her over. He started by pointing out the fundamental flaws in the prosecution's case. "My receipt proves I paid for everything." The store clerk confirmed that, James explained, his voice steady. "But there is one major issue here. Officer Hayes failed to check the store's security footage before making this arrest." She didn't ask the store clerk what he saw. She didn't even bother to check her own body camera footage. The room grew tense as James turned toward Officer Hayes. "You acted on an assumption, Officer Hayes. You didn't follow proper procedure and you ignored the evidence that could have proved my innocence." Hayes stood, visibly flustered, and tried to defend herself. "I saw him pocket something." "The footage wasn't necessary," she said, her voice defensive. James didn't back down. "So you chose to arrest me based on your own assumptions, and when you didn't get the answer you wanted, you ignored everything that could have proven me innocent." His voice was calm but strong, and the silence in the room spoke volumes. He then turned to the judge, addressing her directly. "Your Honor, I request that we review both the store's security footage and my body camera footage. If the evidence is reviewed properly, it will clearly show that I am telling the truth." The prosecutor stood to object, but James quickly countered. "Isn't it your duty to verify all the evidence before filing charges? Why didn't Officer Hayes review the footage?" The judge turned to the prosecutor, her eyes narrowing. "Objection overruled," she said. "We will review the footage." The prosecutor, who had been so confident just moments before, faltered. He stammered as he tried to salvage his case, but it was too late. The judge had already made her decision. James had put a crack in their case wide enough for the truth to slip through. He could see the unease in Officer Hayes' posture now, the shift in her confident demeanor. James had done it. He had exposed the flaws in their case, and now it was just a matter of waiting for the truth to come out. He wasn't just fighting to clear his name. He was exposing a system that too often decided guilt before seeking the truth. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as James stood tall, addressing the judge with calm precision. He had already made his case, but now it was time to expose the true nature of the situation. The request to review the security footage and his own body camera footage hung in the air. The prosecutor, clearly caught off guard, shifted uncomfortably in his seat before rising to respond. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, his voice strained. "The security footage and body camera footage were not reviewed during the initial investigation." James could see the unease spreading across the prosecutor's face, and a quiet murmur ran through the courtroom. Hayes, who had been standing with her arms crossed, stiffened, her gaze narrowing. She had expected this case to be simple, but now it was spiraling out of her control. James seized the opportunity. "So, let me get this straight. You made an arrest without reviewing the security footage and without checking the body cam footage, and you didn't bother to follow up with the clerk or consider any other witnesses." His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable edge to it. Hayes' discomfort was evident, but she remained silent. The prosecutor looked flustered, fumbling with his papers, trying to find a way to salvage the situation. James pressed on. "Officer Hayes, you didn't even take the time to get the facts straight before accusing me. And now you're telling me that the most critical evidence was ignored." James turned toward the judge, his voice cutting through the tension. "I believe this case isn't just about a mistake, it's about a pattern of bias and negligence." The courtroom fell silent. James wasn't done yet. He turned to the judge again, his mind sharp and calculating. "Your Honor, I would also like to request a review of Officer Hayes' past arrest reports. Specifically, any incidents of racial profiling. It's important that we understand if her behavior today was an isolated incident." The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded, signaling for the court to retrieve the records. A few moments later, the results appeared on the screen. The court gasped as a series of complaints about Officer Hayes' past arrests for racial profiling appeared in full view. In the last 2 years alone, there were multiple allegations against her for unfairly targeting black individuals. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom, forcing the judge to reassess Hayes' credibility. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and it was clear that a deeper investigation into her past actions was necessary. The courtroom was deathly silent as the judge reviewed the evidence James had presented. Every word he had spoken, every question he had asked, had chipped away at the foundation of Officer Hayes' accusations. Her story had unraveled completely. With no security footage, no body camera footage, and multiple inconsistencies in her testimony, the case against James had no substance. After a long pause, the judge spoke, her voice firm. "Based on the evidence presented, I hereby dismiss all charges against Mr. Carter. This case is closed." James exhaled slowly, the weight of the last few days lifting from his shoulders. He had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been unjustly targeted before him. The courtroom remained quiet as James stood tall, meeting the eyes of the judge and the few onlookers who had witnessed his fight for justice. But the story didn't end there. The judge turned to Officer Hayes, her expression cold. "I am initiating an internal investigation into your actions, Officer Hayes," she announced. "The court has serious concerns about your conduct, and your history of misconduct and racial bias will be thoroughly examined." James' heart pounded, but it wasn't just relief he felt. There was a sense of justice, finally, taking shape. Officer Hayes would not simply walk away unscathed. Her career, her credibility, and her actions would now be scrutinized by those who had the power to hold her accountable. As James walked out of the courtroom, he felt a surge of determination. He wasn't just clearing his name. He was standing up against a broken system that had far too often overlooked the biases and flaws within it. The fight for justice didn't end here. James had spent years working in finance, but now he saw an opportunity to make a true difference. He decided to start a legal defense fund aimed at helping those who couldn't afford to fight back against racial discrimination and injustice. Too many people lacked the resources to defend themselves in the legal system, and James was determined to change that. As he walked out of the courthouse, he knew this was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. His victory wasn't just about him. It was about making sure no one else had to face what he had gone through alone. James' story was not just about clearing his name. It was about the power of standing up for justice, no matter the odds. Throughout the ordeal, James had been confronted with the harsh reality that the system wasn't always fair, but he also realized that his knowledge of the law gave him the ability to fight back. His victory was proof that when one stands firm in the face of injustice, they can make a real difference, not only for themselves, but for those who don't have the same means to speak out. His journey also served as a reminder of the importance of holding systems accountable, especially those that have long been flawed. James knew that this fight wasn't over. He was determined to continue his mission. He made it clear that no one, regardless of their race or background, should ever be judged unfairly. Every person deserved the right to be treated equally, and no one should have to suffer simply because of their appearance. James ended his story with a call for change. The legal system needed reform, and he was committed to being part of that change, ensuring that everyone, no matter their circumstances, had the chance to seek justice.